In the shadowed corridors of royal power, where whispers carry more weight than shouted commands, one man's refusal to bend changed the course of history. When duty collides with desire and loyalty faces its ultimate test, the choices made in silence echo through generations. This is the story of a god who stood between tradition and transformation, holding fast to orders that would reshape a kingdom's future. Some doors, once closed, can never be reopened. Some vaults, once sealed, protect more than treasure. They protect the very soul of sovereignty itself. What happens when the most powerful woman in the realm demands entry to what she believes is rightfully hers, only to be met by an immovable force following orders from the heir apparent? This is not just a tale of royal protocol gone awry. This is the story of how one moment of refusal rippled through the highest echelons of power, revealing secrets, testing alliances, and ultimately defining what it truly means to serve the crown. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like secrets refusing to be revealed. Thomas Hartwell had been standing guard at the entrance to the sovereign's vault for exactly 47 minutes when the distinctive sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Not just any footsteps. These carried authority, purpose, and the unmistakable rhythm of someone accustomed to having doors open before they even knocked. Thomas straightened his shoulders, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the ceremonial sword at his side. At 34, he had served the royal guard for 12 years, and his record was spotless. Not once had he failed in his duty, not once had he questioned an order, and not once had he allowed unauthorized entry to any restricted area under his protection. Today would test every principle he had lived by. The Duke of Rothesay's instructions had been crystal clear when he had personally delivered them just hours earlier. No one enters the vault, Thomas. No one. Not staff, not advisors, not family members. The contents are being catalogued for the transition, and absolute security is paramount. Do you understand? The future king's eyes had held an unusual intensity, and Thomas had recognized the weight of the moment.
Yes, Your Royal Highness.
Understood completely. Now, as the footsteps grew closer, Thomas could make out the familiar voices of the approaching party. His heart began to race, not from fear, but from the growing realization that his oath of service was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The corridor, usually empty except for the occasional servant or security sweep, was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would ripple through the monarchy itself. Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, rounded the corner with her characteristic poise, accompanied by two of her personal staff and a castle administrator who looked increasingly uncomfortable with each step. Her designer handbag was clutched firmly in her right hand, and her expression carried the confidence of someone who had never been denied access to anything she sought within these walls. Behind her, Margaret Thornbury, her longtime personal secretary, carried a leather portfolio that Thomas assumed contained official documentation for whatever business had brought them here. "Good morning, Thomas," Camilla said with the practiced warmth that had served her well in public appearances. Her voice carried the slight breathiness that made her instantly recognizable, but underneath it, Thomas detected something else, a steely determination that suggested this was not a casual visit.
Your Royal Highness,
Thomas replied, offering the traditional bow while maintaining his position directly in front of the vault's ornate entrance. The door behind him was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, heavy oak reinforced with steel and decorated with the royal coat of arms. It had protected the crown's most precious possessions for over 2 centuries, and today it would protect them still. "I need to access the vault," Camilla continued, her tone remaining pleasant but with an underlying edge that suggested she expected immediate compliance. "There are some personal items that belong to my late mother-in-law that require my attention. I'm sure you understand the sensitivity of the situation." Thomas felt his throat tighten. The mention of the late Queen brought a familiar pang of loss. She had been more than a monarch to the staff who served her. She had been the anchor that held everything together. But even grief could not override his direct orders. "I'm terribly sorry, Your Royal Highness, but I have strict instructions that no one is to enter the vault at this time. The Duke of Rothesay has personally ordered that access be restricted while cataloguing is underway." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret shifted uncomfortably behind her employer, while the castle administrator seemed to shrink into himself. This was clearly not the response Camilla had expected, and the slight tightening around her eyes suggested that her patience was already beginning to wear thin. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," she replied, her voice maintaining its controlled pleasantness despite the obvious irritation. "As the Queen Consort designate, I certainly have the authority to access materials that pertain to the royal family's private effects." These are not crown jewels, Thomas. These are personal belongings. Thomas had anticipated this argument, and he had spent the sleepless hours since receiving his orders thinking about how to handle exactly this situation. His loyalty was not in question. It belonged entirely to the crown and the chain of command that flowed from it. But the chain of command was changing, shifting, and he found himself caught between the old order and the new. With the greatest respect, Your Royal Highness, Thomas replied carefully, my orders come directly from His Royal Highness the Duke of Rothesay, and they were quite specific. No exceptions were mentioned. I cannot allow access to anyone without his direct authorization. The corridor seemed to grow colder. Camilla's pleasant facade began to crack, revealing the steel underneath. She had not risen to her position by accepting refusal gracefully, and her years navigating the treacherous waters of royal protocol had taught her when to push and when to retreat. This was clearly a moment for pushing. Then I suggest you contact the Duke immediately, she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes treated as commands. I'm sure this can be resolved quickly with a simple phone call. Thomas felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He had no direct line to the Duke, and the protocol for such situations was murky at best. The royal family's internal hierarchies were complex webs of tradition, precedents, and personal relationships that could shift based on circumstances, moods, and political considerations. What was clear was that he was now standing at the center of what could become a significant internal conflict. I'm afraid His Royal Highness left specific instructions that he was not to be disturbed unless there was an emergency, Thomas replied, hating how weak his voice sounded even to his own ears. The cataloging process requires his complete focus, and he emphasized the importance of maintaining absolute security during this period. Margaret leaned forward and whispered something in Camilla's ear, but whatever she said only seemed to increase the Duchess's determination. The castle administrator, meanwhile, had developed a fascination with his shoes that suggested he desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Young man, Camilla said, and the shift in her tone was unmistakable. The pleasantries were over, and what remained was pure authority backed by years of experience in getting what she wanted. I am not some tourist seeking a peek at the crown jewels. I am a member of this family, and I have responsibilities that extend far beyond your understanding of protocol. Now, I'm asking you one final time. Step aside and allow me access to that vault. The moments stretched between them like a taut wire. Thomas could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The knowledge that his next words would either preserve the chain of command that had sustained the monarchy for centuries, or shatter it in service to personal relationships and emotional appeals. He thought of his oath of service, sworn on a Bible in front of witnesses, promising to protect and serve the crown above all other considerations. He also thought of the Duke of Rothesay's eyes when he had delivered those orders, the unusual intensity that had suggested something far more complex than a simple cataloguing operation. There had been urgency there, and perhaps even fear, emotions that Thomas had never before associated with the future king. Your Royal Highness, Thomas said, his voice finding strength from somewhere deep within his sense of duty, I cannot and will not disobey a direct order from His Royal Highness the Duke of Rothesay. If you wish access to the vault, you must obtain his personal authorization. Until that time, I am bound by my oath to maintain security. The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla's face flushed slightly, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if he had just ended his career with a few words. But he had made his choice, and he would stand by it regardless of the consequences. Very well, Camilla said finally, her voice ice-cold. I will remember this conversation, Thomas, and I will remember your name. She turned on her heel with the precision of a military maneuver and began walking back down the corridor, her entourage hurrying to keep pace. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Thomas remained at his post, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. The vault behind him contained more than personal effects and historical artifacts. It held secrets that could reshape the monarchy itself. And he had just refused access to the woman who would soon be queen. The morning mist continued to cling to the ancient stones, but now it felt less like secrets refusing to be revealed, and more like a shroud covering something that was already dead. 3 hours after his confrontation with Camilla, Thomas received word that His Royal Highness the Duke of Rothesay requested his immediate presence in the blue drawing room. The summons came through proper channels, but the unusual location suggested this was not a routine debriefing. The blue drawing room was reserved for private family discussions, away from the formal protocols of throne rooms and state chambers. Thomas made his way through corridors that seemed somehow different now, as if his morning's actions had shifted the very atmosphere of the castle. Staff members he passed offered their usual respectful nods. But he wondered if news of his refusal had already begun to spread through the complex network of servants, advisors, and hangers-on who formed the invisible backbone of royal life. The Duke was standing by the tall windows when Thomas entered, his silhouette framed against the grey afternoon sky. Charles Philip Arthur George, soon to be King Charles III, carried himself with the careful posture of a man who had spent 7 decades preparing for a role he had never been certain he wanted. At 74, he possessed the thoughtful demeanor of someone who had observed power from close proximity but had only recently begun to truly wield it. "Thomas," the Duke said without turning around, "I understand you had an interesting morning." "Yes, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, standing at attention despite the informal setting. "I followed your instructions exactly as given." The Duke turned slowly, and Thomas was struck by how much older he appeared than he had just that morning. The weight of recent events, his mother's passing, the transition of power, the countless decisions both public and private, seemed to have settled on his shoulders like a visible burden. "And how did the Duchess respond to your adherence to protocol?" The question was asked with the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. "She was not pleased, Your Royal Highness. She made it clear that she considered my refusal inappropriate given her position in the family." Thomas paused, then decided honesty was his only option. "She also said she would remember my name." A thin smile crossed the Duke's features, though it carried no warmth. "I'm sure she will. Camilla has an excellent memory for such things. It's one of her more useful qualities." He moved away from the window and settled into one of the blue damask chairs that gave the room its name. "Please sit down, Thomas. This conversation requires more than formal protocol." Thomas perched on the edge of a matching chair, uncomfortable with the unusual informality but unwilling to disobey. The room around them whispered of centuries of similar conversations, family discussions that had shaped the course of nations, decisions made in private that would echo through history. "What I'm about to tell you," the Duke continued, "goes beyond your normal duties as a guard. It touches on matters that could affect not just the royal family, but the institution of monarchy itself. I need to know that I can trust your discretion absolutely." "You have it, Your Royal Highness, completely." The Duke studied Thomas's face for a long moment, as if searching for any hint of doubt or weakness. Satisfied with what he saw, he leaned back in his chair and began to speak. "The vault you're guarding contains more than historical artifacts and personal effects. Among my mother's papers are documents that detail certain arrangements that were made during the difficult years following my first marriage's dissolution. Arrangements that were necessary to protect the crown's stability, but which could be deeply damaging if they were to become public knowledge." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The late Queen's private papers were legendary among the palace staff. Decades of correspondence, personal observations, and decisions that had shaped the modern monarchy. But the Duke's tone suggested something far more sensitive than typical royal documentation. "These arrangements," the Duke continued carefully, "involve financial settlements, communication records, and certain assurances that were given to various parties during the transition period, when Camilla's role in my life was evolving. They represent a pragmatic approach to managing a delicate situation, but they could be misinterpreted by those who wish to damage the crown's reputation." The implications began to dawn on Thomas. The years following Princess Diana's death had been turbulent ones for the royal family, filled with public criticism, media scrutiny, and careful reputation management. If there were documents that revealed the behind-the-scenes negotiations and arrangements that had smoothed Camilla's acceptance into the royal fold, their release could reignite old controversies and undermine the careful work that had been done to rehabilitate both the Duke's and Camilla's public images. "Camilla believes," the Duke said, his voice growing more strained, "that as my consort-to-be, she should have access to all documents that concern her role in the family. She's not wrong in principle. Transparency between spouses is generally advisable. But these particular documents, they contain details of conversations, decisions, and arrangements that were made during a very different time, under very different circumstances." Thomas began to understand the complexity of his position. He wasn't just guarding against unauthorized access. He was standing between two people who loved each other but whose interests had suddenly diverged in a fundamental way. Some of these documents, the Duke continued, detail the careful orchestration of public opinion, the management of media narratives, and the substantial resources that were devoted to ensuring Camilla's acceptance by the British people. They show the monarchy not as a natural institution guided by divine providence, but as a carefully managed political entity that adapts its messaging to maintain public support. The Duke rose from his chair and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Thomas recognized as a sign of deep internal conflict. They also contain correspondence between my mother and various religious leaders, political figures, and international dignitaries regarding the theological and constitutional implications of my remarriage. Some of these exchanges reveal doubts, compromises, and expedient decisions that could be deeply damaging to the Crown's moral authority. Thomas felt the full weight of what he was protecting settling on his shoulders. These weren't just historical documents. They were potential weapons that could undermine decades of careful reputation building and threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. But surely, Thomas ventured carefully, the Duchess understands the sensitive nature of such materials. She's demonstrated considerable political acumen over the years. The Duke's expression darkened slightly. Camilla's political instincts are indeed excellent, but her perspective on these matters has evolved significantly since we married. She believes that full transparency between us is more important than institutional protection. She's argued that hidden documents and sealed records are the tools of the old monarchy, secretive, unaccountable, and ultimately unsustainable in the modern world. Thomas could see the Duke's dilemma clearly now. His wife wanted access to documents that could potentially destroy them both, believing that honesty and openness were more important than careful image management. The Duke, trained from birth in the delicate art of monarchy, understood that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. There's another complication, the Duke added, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Some of these documents involve arrangements that were made without Camilla's full knowledge or consent. Decisions about her public image, her role, even her personal relationships, were made by others during the early years of our courtship. She suspected this for some time, and she believes the vault contains proof of how she was manipulated and managed without her awareness. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Camilla wasn't just seeking access to historical records. She was looking for evidence of how she had been controlled and shaped to fit the monarchy's needs, possibly without her full understanding or agreement. If she's right, Thomas asked, and such documents exist, wouldn't she have a right to see them? The Duke stopped pacing and fixed Thomas with an intense stare. Rights, Thomas, are a luxury that royalty cannot always afford. The question is not what Camilla has a right to see, but what the monarchy can survive her seeing. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, especially for someone who will soon be queen consort. The Duke moved to a small table where a crystal decanter sat alongside matching glasses. He poured himself a small measure of what looked like whiskey despite the early hour, and took a careful sip before continuing. My mother understood this principle implicitly. She spent 70 years balancing personal desires against institutional needs, and she rarely chose the former when they conflicted. But Camilla comes from a different world, with different values. She believes in personal authenticity over political necessity. Thomas began to grasp the true scope of his assignment. He wasn't just preventing unauthorized access to historical documents, he was serving as the final barrier between personal truth and institutional survival. The vault behind him contained not just papers, but the potential destruction of carefully constructed narratives that had taken decades to establish. "What am I protecting them from, Your Royal Highness?" Thomas asked directly. "What specifically would happen if these documents became public?" The Duke finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. "The end of the monarchy as we know it, Thomas. Perhaps not immediately, but inevitably. These documents would provide ammunition for every Republican, every critic, every person who has ever questioned whether the Crown serves the nation or only itself. They would reveal the monarchy not as an ancient institution guided by divine providence and noble tradition, but as a modern political organization that manipulates public opinion through careful messaging and vast financial resources." The silence stretched between them as Thomas absorbed the full implications. He was protecting more than documents. He was protecting a carefully constructed mythology that had sustained the British monarchy through centuries of change and challenge. "And if the Duchess gains access to these materials?" Thomas asked. The Duke's expression grew pained. "Camilla is not a malicious person, Thomas. She's intelligent, capable, and deeply committed to the institution she's about to serve. But she's also someone who values truth over convenience, transparency over tradition. If she reads these documents, she will want to address the issues they raise. She will want to acknowledge past mistakes, compensate those who were harmed, and rebuild relationships on more honest foundations. That sounds admirable, Thomas observed carefully. It is admirable, the Duke agreed. It's also potentially catastrophic. The monarchy survives on mystique, Thomas. It depends on the public's belief that we are somehow different from ordinary politicians, more noble, more principled, guided by higher purposes. These documents would reveal us as we really are, flawed human beings making difficult decisions under enormous pressure, sometimes choosing institutional survival over personal integrity. Thomas understood now why the Duke's orders had been so specific and so urgent. The transition period following the Queen's death had created a unique window of vulnerability, when old certainties were being questioned and new relationships were being established. The documents in the vault represented both the past and the future, evidence of how the monarchy had evolved to survive, and potential weapons that could destroy it entirely. Your instructions remain the same, Thomas, the Duke said finally. No one enters that vault without my direct, personal authorization. Not staff, not advisors, not family members. The contents will remain secure until I can determine the best way to handle them, whether that means careful destruction, indefinite storage, or selective disclosure under controlled circumstances. Thomas nodded, understanding that his role had just evolved from simple guard duty to something far more complex and dangerous. He was now a participant in a delicate balance between personal relationships and institutional survival, between truth and necessary fiction. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Thomas's post. Sir Edmund Hawthorne, private secretary to the Duchess of Cornwall, approached with the measured stride of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. At 62, Sir Edmund possessed the refined bearing that came from Eton, Oxford, and 30 years of diplomatic service before joining the royal household. His presence at the vault was both surprising and ominous. "Hartwell," Sir Edmund said with the crisp pronunciation that marked him as part of Britain's traditional establishment. "I trust you're well this morning?" Thomas straightened instinctively. Sir Edmund's reputation preceded him. A man who could destroy careers with a carefully placed word, or resurrect them with an equally strategic recommendation. His approach was always polite, always proper, and always deadly effective. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking." "Splendid." Sir Edmund adjusted his already perfect tie and glanced meaningfully at the vault door. "I understand there was some confusion yesterday regarding access protocols. Her Royal Highness the Duchess was understandably frustrated by the miscommunication." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with being caught between competing authorities. Sir Edmund's words were carefully chosen. He wasn't criticizing Thomas directly, but he was making it clear that yesterday's events were being reframed as a simple misunderstanding rather than a direct refusal of royal authority. "There was no confusion, sir," Thomas replied carefully. "I followed my direct orders from His Royal Highness the Duke of Rothesay. Those orders were quite specific." Sir Edmund's smile remained pleasant, but his eyes grew slightly colder. "Ah yes, orders. Such an interesting concept in the modern royal household, don't you think? The lines of authority can become complex during transition periods. What matters to one member of the family may not seem as urgent to another." The implied criticism of the Duke was subtle but unmistakable. Sir Edmund was suggesting that the Duke's priorities might not align with broader family interests, and that Thomas might be serving as an unwitting pawn in a larger dispute. "I serve the Crown, sir," Thomas replied, falling back on a fundamental principle that had guided his entire career. "I follow the chain of command as it's been established." "Of course you do," Sir Edmund agreed smoothly. "And that's precisely why Her Royal Highness values your service so highly. She's mentioned to me on several occasions how impressed she's been with your dedication and professionalism over the years." Thomas felt a chill of recognition. This was how palace politics worked. Praise that seemed genuine but carried an underlying threat. Compliments that were actually negotiations in disguise. Sir Edmund was building towards something, and Thomas doubted he would like the destination. "The Duchess wanted me to clarify something that may not have been properly communicated yesterday," Sir Edmund continued. "The items she seeks to access in the vault are not general royal property or state documents. They are specifically personal effects that belonged to her late mother-in-law, items that were promised to her during the Queen's final months." This was new information, and Thomas felt his certainty beginning to waver. If the late Queen had indeed promised specific items to Camilla, then the situation became far more complex than a simple matter of following orders. "I wasn't made aware of any such promises, sir," Thomas replied. "My orders made no exceptions for personal items or prior commitments." Sir Edmund nodded sympathetically. Of course they didn't. His Royal Highness is dealing with enormous pressures right now, and it's perfectly understandable that some details might be overlooked in his instructions to security personnel. The transition period is extraordinarily challenging for everyone involved. The implied criticism was growing stronger. Sir Edmund was painting the Duke as overwhelmed and possibly unreliable, while positioning Camilla as someone trying to honor commitments made by the late Queen. It was a masterful piece of political manipulation, designed to make Thomas question his orders without directly attacking the Duke's authority. The specific items in question, Sir Edmund continued, producing a leather folder from his briefcase, are documented here in correspondence between Her late Majesty and the Duchess. Love letters from the Duke's father, personal jewelry that was designated for Camilla's use, and certain photographs from family celebrations that hold deep sentimental value. Thomas glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. Accepting documentation from Sir Edmund would be the first step in a process that would inevitably lead to him opening the vault against the Duke's explicit orders. I understand the sensitivity of the situation, sir, Thomas replied, but my orders were clear and came directly from the future king. I cannot alter my duties based on secondary documentation or competing claims. Sir Edmund's expression remained pleasant, but Thomas could see the calculation behind his eyes. This had been the diplomatic approach, the attempt to resolve the situation through reasonable conversation and appeals to Thomas's sense of fairness. Since that approach was failing, Sir Edmund would now escalate to more direct pressure. Thomas, Sir Edmund said, and the shift to his first name was deliberate. I hope you understand the position you're placing yourself in. Her Royal Highness is not accustomed to having her reasonable requests denied, particularly when those requests involve honoring commitments made by the late Queen. Your inflexibility in this matter is being noted by people who will have considerable influence over your future career prospects. There it was, the velvet glove removed to reveal the iron fist beneath. Sir Edmund was making it clear that Thomas's refusal to cooperate would have consequences that extended far beyond this single incident.
In the enclosed world of royal service, a reputation for being difficult or uncooperative could effectively end a career.
I appreciate your concern for my future, Sir, Thomas replied, drawing on reserves of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. But I took an oath to serve the crown faithfully, and that means following lawful orders from my superiors regardless of personal consequences. Sir Edmund studied Thomas for a long moment, clearly recalibrating his approach. The threats had failed just as surely as the diplomatic appeals, which left him with limited options. But Sir Edmund hadn't survived 3 decades in royal service by giving up easily. Very well, he said finally. I'll convey your position to Her Royal Highness. I'm sure she'll be interested in your perspective on duty and loyalty. After Sir Edmund departed, Thomas found himself facing a new challenge. Word of his confrontations with both Camilla and her private secretary had clearly begun to spread through the palace's invisible network of gossip and intrigue. Throughout the day, he noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with him. Some staff members seemed more respectful, viewing his stance as principled, while others appeared wary, as if his refusal to bend might somehow contaminate them. The afternoon brought another unexpected development. Lady Patricia Morrison, the Queen's former lady-in-waiting, and one of the most respected figures in the royal household, approached Thomas's position with the careful steps of someone well into her 80s, but still possessed a formidable dignity. "Good afternoon, Thomas," she said in the cultured tones that spoke of a lifetime spent in the highest circles of British society. "I wonder if I might have a word." Lady Patricia's presence was both reassuring and concerning. She had served the late Queen for over 50 years and was widely regarded as one of the few people who truly understood the inner workings of the monarchy. If she was involving herself in this situation, it meant the conflict had reached the highest levels of palace hierarchy. "Of course, my lady," Thomas replied, offering the deep bow that her service and age demanded. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your recent interactions," she said with the directness that had made her legendary among palace staff. "It seems you found yourself in the middle of a rather delicate family discussion." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. Lady Patricia's loyalties were complex. She had served the late Queen faithfully, but she had also been instrumental in helping Camilla establish her role within the royal family. Her perspective on the current conflict was impossible to predict. "I'm simply following my orders, my lady," Thomas replied carefully. Lady Patricia smiled, and for a moment Thomas caught a glimpse of the sharp intelligence that had made her such an effective advisor to the Queen. "Yes, I'm sure you are, but orders, Thomas, can sometimes conflict with larger obligations. The question becomes, what does true service to the Crown actually require in such circumstances? It was the same question Thomas had been wrestling with since the Duke's revelations about the vault's contents. Was he serving the crown by protecting potentially damaging documents, or would he serve it better by allowing transparency and honesty to prevail? Her late Majesty, Lady Patricia continued, often spoke about the balance between institutional preservation and personal integrity. She believed that the monarchy's greatest strength lay not in its ability to hide difficult truths, but in its capacity to acknowledge them and move forward with dignity. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Lady Patricia was suggesting that the late Queen would have supported Camilla's desire for access to the documents, which would mean his refusal to open the vault was actually contrary to royal wishes. The Queen also believed, Lady Patricia added, that trust between family members was the foundation of institutional strength. Secrets and hidden documents, she often said, were the tools of weak monarchies that feared their own people. The implication was clear. By keeping the vault sealed, Thomas was not protecting the monarchy, but actually undermining it. Lady Patricia was presenting the conflict not as a choice between competing authorities, but as a decision between the old monarchy's secretive ways and the new monarchy's commitment to transparency. However, Lady Patricia said, her tone growing more serious, her late Majesty also understood that some truths are too complex for public consumption, and that protecting the crown sometimes requires difficult decisions about what information should be shared and when. Thomas realized that Lady Patricia was not actually taking sides in the conflict. Instead, she was highlighting the genuine complexity of his situation and the fact that reasonable people could disagree about the proper course of action. "What would you do, my lady?" Thomas asked, abandoning protocol in favor of seeking genuine guidance from someone whose wisdom he respected.
Lady Patricia considered the question for a long moment, her eyes focusing on something beyond the immediate corridor.
I would remember, she said finally, that the crown is not a building or a vault or a collection of documents.
It's an idea, Thomas. The idea that some things are more important than individual desires or immediate convenience. Your job is not to choose between the Duke and the Duchess, but to choose what best serves that idea. With that cryptic guidance, Lady Patricia took her leave, leaving Thomas more uncertain than ever about the proper course of action. The day had brought him face to face with the recognition that his simple role as a guard had evolved into something far more complex. He was now a participant in a fundamental debate about the nature of monarchy itself. As evening approached, Thomas received word that the Duchess would be returning the following morning, accompanied by additional staff members and what were described as relevant legal advisors. The stakes were clearly escalating, and his position at the vault door was becoming the focal point for a conflict that threatened to reshape the royal family's internal dynamics. That night, Thomas lay awake in his modest quarters, staring at the ceiling and wondering if his career would survive the choices he was being forced to make. But more than his personal future, he worried about the institution he had sworn to serve. The monarchy had survived civil wars, world wars, and countless political crises, but it had never before faced a situation where its own family members were in open conflict about fundamental questions of truth and transparency. The vault door behind which he stood guard contained more than historical documents. It held the future of the crown itself, and his decision about who should have access to it would echo through generations of British history. The third morning of Thomas's vigil began with an unexpected stillness. The usual sounds of castle life, servants moving through corridors, the distant murmur of administrative activity, the measured footsteps of other guards making their rounds, seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Thomas had been at his post for exactly 23 minutes when he heard multiple sets of footsteps approaching from both directions. From the east corridor came Camilla, accompanied by Sir Edmund and two men Thomas didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested legal training. From the west came the Duke himself, flanked by his own private secretary and someone Thomas immediately identified as Sir William Thornbury, the Crown's most senior legal advisor. The convergence was clearly planned, and Thomas found himself at the epicenter of what amounted to a royal family showdown. The two groups stopped about 10 feet apart, with Thomas and the vault door positioned directly between them. The silence stretched uncomfortably as husband and wife regarded each other across a divide that seemed to represent far more than physical distance. "Charles," Camilla said finally, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had not slept well. "This has gone on long enough. We need to resolve this situation." The Duke's expression was carefully neutral, but Thomas could see the strain in the tight lines around his eyes. "Indeed we do, Camilla, but resolution requires trust, and trust requires wisdom about when some doors should remain closed." "And when," Camilla replied with steel in her voice, Some truths are too important to keep hidden. Sir William stepped forward slightly, his presence serving as a reminder that this conflict had legal as well as personal dimensions.
Your Royal Highnesses, perhaps we might discuss this matter in a more private setting?
The corridor hardly seems appropriate for such sensitive discussions. Thomas felt a flush of hope that he might be relieved of his impossible position. But the Duke shook his head firmly. No, Sir William. This matter centers on Thomas's duty and the orders he's been given. He should hear what's discussed so he can understand the full scope of his responsibilities. Camilla's legal advisor, a thin man with penetrating eyes, chose that moment to speak.
Mr. Payback.
Hartwell, I am Geoffrey Worthington, representing Her Royal Highness in certain legal matters. I want to make it clear that your continued refusal to allow authorized access to the vault may constitute obstruction of legitimate legal proceedings. The threat was barely veiled, and Thomas felt his resolve wavering under the combined pressure of competing authorities, legal implications, and personal consequences. But before he could respond, the Duke stepped forward with an authority that seemed to fill the corridor. Mr. Worthington, the Duke said with icy politeness, Thomas is following direct orders from the heir to the throne. Any suggestion that such obedience constitutes legal obstruction is both incorrect and inappropriate. I suggest you focus your legal expertise on matters within your actual purview. The exchange revealed the depth of the conflict between the royal couple. This was no longer a simple disagreement about access to documents. It had become a fundamental test of authority and loyalty within the monarchy itself. Camilla seemed to recognize that the confrontational approach was failing. Her expression softened slightly as she addressed Thomas directly. Thomas, I want you to understand that this isn't about defying authority or creating conflict. This is about honoring commitments that were made to me by someone we all loved and respected. She produced a letter from her handbag, its royal stationery immediately recognizable. This is a personal note from Her late Majesty, written just 2 months before her passing. In it, she specifically mentions certain items that she wanted me to have, items that are currently sealed in that vault. Thomas glanced at the Duke, who nodded slightly, indicating that he should listen to what Camilla had to say. The letter mentions a sapphire brooch that belonged to Queen Victoria, one that the Queen wanted me to wear at Charles's coronation as a symbol of continuity. It references personal correspondence between the Queen and my late mother, documents that I believe could help heal some old wounds within the family. Most importantly, it mentions a private diary that the Queen kept during the most difficult years following Diana's death, a diary that she believed would help me understand the impossible decisions that were made during that period. Thomas felt the emotional weight of Camilla's words. These weren't demands based on position or authority. They were pleas based on personal relationships and promised inheritances from a beloved mother-in-law. The Duke's expression had grown increasingly pained as Camilla spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment before responding. Everything you've said is true, Camilla, he admitted quietly. Mother did make those promises to you, and under normal circumstances, honoring them would be a simple matter. But the circumstances are not normal, and the documents you're seeking to access include far more than the items she specifically mentioned. Sir Edmund stepped forward with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opening. Your Royal Highness, surely the solution is obvious. Allow Her Royal Highness to access the specific items mentioned in the Queen's letter while keeping other documents secure until they can be properly reviewed. It was a reasonable compromise, and Thomas found himself hoping that both sides would accept it, but the Duke shook his head with obvious regret. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Sir Edmund. The items Camilla seeks are intermingled with other documents that cannot be separated without a complete cataloguing and review process. Opening the vault for selective access would necessarily expose materials that must remain confidential. Thomas began to understand why the Duke's orders had been so absolute. The vault's contents were apparently organized in such a way that accessing some items would inevitably reveal others, making selective disclosure impossible. Camilla's legal advisor saw his opportunity and seized it. Then, the logical solution is full disclosure under appropriate confidentiality agreements. Her Royal Highness is certainly capable of maintaining discretion about sensitive materials. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas could see that it placed the Duke in an impossible position. Either he admitted that he didn't trust his own wife with sensitive information, or he allowed access to materials that could potentially destroy them both. The Duke's response when it came revealed the full depth of his dilemma. Geoffrey, you're asking me to make a decision that could affect not just my family, but the institution of monarchy itself. The documents in that vault include correspondence, financial records, and personal observations that reveal how modern royalty actually functions. The compromises, the calculations, the carefully managed deceptions that allow us to serve effectively in a democratic society. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down on the corridor. The Duke was admitting that the monarchy's public image was partially manufactured, maintained through careful control of information and strategic presentation of truth. Some of those documents, the Duke continued, detail the substantial resources that were devoted to managing public opinion during Camilla's integration into the royal family. They show how polling data influenced royal decisions, how media narratives were crafted and disseminated, how public ceremonies were designed to achieve specific political objectives. Camilla's expression shifted from frustration to something approaching shock. Are you saying that our relationship, our marriage, our public life together has been nothing but political theatre? No, the Duke replied quickly, but I am saying that the timing, presentation, and public understanding of our relationship was carefully managed in ways that you weren't always fully aware of. Some of the decisions that were made to protect us both were made without your knowledge or consent. The personal pain in both their voices was evident to everyone present. This wasn't just about institutional secrecy. It was about fundamental trust between two people who had built their lives together. Lady Patricia's voice came from behind Thomas, startling everyone present. None of them had noticed her approach, but she now stood at the edge of the group, with the quiet authority that had made her legendary within the royal household. Your Royal Highnesses, she said with the gentle firmness that had guided the royal family through decades of crises. Perhaps the question is not whether these documents should be seen, but whether they should continue to exist at all. The suggestion sent a shock through both groups. Lady Patricia was proposing something that had never been seriously considered: the deliberate destruction of historical royal documents. Her late Majesty, Lady Patricia continued, often spoke about the burden that comprehensive records placed on future generations. She believed that some knowledge was simply too dangerous to preserve regardless of its historical value. Sir William looked horrified at the suggestion. Lady Patricia, these are irreplaceable historical documents. Their destruction would be a loss to scholarship and national heritage. Their preservation, Lady Patricia replied calmly, may be a threat to the institution they were created to serve. Her late Majesty understood that the monarch's survival sometimes requires difficult choices about what knowledge should be passed down and what should be allowed to fade into history. Thomas realized that Lady Patricia was offering a solution that neither the Duke nor Camilla had considered, eliminating the source of their conflict entirely rather than determining who should have access to it. The Duke looked thoughtful, while Camilla appeared torn between relief and disappointment. The prospect of destroying the documents would eliminate the risk of damaging revelations, but it would also mean never learning the full truth about decisions that had shaped her life.
There is precedent, Lady Patricia added gently.
Royal documents have been selectively destroyed throughout history when their preservation posed risks to the crown. Queen Victoria herself ordered the destruction of certain papers, as did George VI during the constitutional crisis of 1936. The comparison to previous monarchs who had faced similar dilemmas seemed to resonate with the Duke. Thomas could see him weighing the historical precedent against the personal cost of keeping secrets from his wife. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, the Duke spoke. Very well. The documents will be catalogued by a select committee consisting of myself, Sir William, and Lady Patricia. Items that serve legitimate historical purposes and pose no threat to institutional security will be preserved. Items that represent purely personal correspondence or private family matters will be returned to their intended recipients. And items that could damage the crown or compromise national interests will be destroyed according to established protocol. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered something to everyone. Camilla would gain access to items that had been promised to her. Historians would preserve documents of genuine historical value, and the monarchy would be protected from potentially damaging revelations. Camilla studied her husband's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. I can accept that arrangement, but with one condition. I want to be present when the cataloguing committee reviews documents that specifically concern me or my role in the family. I won't accept decisions about my own history being made without my input. The Duke's expression showed both relief and continuing concern. Agreed, but the final decisions about preservation or destruction rest with the crown. Thomas felt a profound sense of relief as the tension in the corridor finally began to dissipate. His role as the guardian of dangerous secrets was ending, replaced by a more collaborative process that balanced competing interests and concerns. As the groups began to disperse, the Duke approached Thomas directly. You served the crown well during a very difficult period, Thomas. Your steadfast adherence to duty helped ensure that this situation was resolved through discussion rather than conflict. That service will be remembered. Camilla also paused as she passed, offering Thomas a smile that seemed genuine rather than diplomatic. Thank you for doing your job so thoroughly, Thomas. I know this wasn't easy for you. As the corridor emptied, Thomas remained at his post, but his duties had fundamentally changed. He was no longer guarding secrets that could destroy the monarchy. He was protecting a collaborative process that might actually strengthen it through carefully managed transparency. The vault door behind him would soon be opened, its contents examined, sorted, and either preserved or destroyed according to their value and potential risk. Some truths would finally see light, others would be buried forever, and the institution of monarchy would continue its ancient dance between tradition and adaptation. Thomas had learned that serving the crown sometimes meant more than following orders. It meant understanding when rigid obedience served institutional interests, and when flexibility better honored the deeper principles that made the monarchy worth preserving. His 3 days at the vault door had taught him that true loyalty sometimes required questioning authority, and that the greatest service to the crown might come from helping it navigate the complex relationship between truth and survival.